Welcome back to Voices of the Past. Tonight, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela.
Good evening. It is strange to be asked to speak plainly. For much of my life, plain speech was the most dangerous thing a man could offer.
Then let's start there, with your name, before anyone made you into a symbol. Rolihlahla. What does it mean?
In Xhosa, it means literally pulling the branch of a tree. But its true meaning, the meaning my elders used, was trouser to troublemaker. My father gave me that name. I do not believe a name is destiny. I am not a mystic, but I confess that in later years, friends who watched the storms of my life, both the ones I caused and the ones I merely weathered, found it a fitting joke of fate. I was born the 18th of July, 1918, in a village called Mvezo, on the banks of the Mbashe River. It was, in every sense, a place apart from the world. And yet, in that same year, a delegation of the African National Congress traveled all the way to Versailles to place the grievances of my people before the peacemakers of Europe. Nobody listened to them. I did not know as a boy watching cattle that I had been born into that argument.
Your English name, Nelson, that came later.
On my first day of school, it was the custom then among Christian teachers to give African children English names, as though our own were not sufficient for civilized use. I do not say this bitterly. My teacher, Miss Mdingane, was a kind woman. But you must understand what it tells a child to be handed a new name at the schoolhouse door as the price of entry. It teaches you, before you can even read, that the world you are entering was not built with you in mind.
Tell me about your father. I understand he lost his chieftainship.
My father, Gadla Henry Mpakanyiswa, was a counselor to the Tembo king and a chief in his own right at a place called Mvezo. He was an unofficial prime minister to the throne, a man of pride and temper. I inherited a measure of both, I'm told. He lost his position not through crime, but through defiance. A minor dispute arose over an ox, and my father was summoned before a magistrate, a white magistrate, under the system the British had imposed, and he refused to appear on the grounds that only the king, not a colonial official, had authority over him. It was a small act. It cost him everything: his position, his land, most of his wealth. But I've thought about it for the whole of my life because it was my first lesson, before I understood a single word of politics, that a man may lose everything and still keep something more valuable, which is the right to say, this authority is not legitimate and I will not bow to it. My father did not use those words. He did not need to. His life said it for him.
And when he died?
I was 9. My mother took me on foot to Mkagazweni, the great place, to be raised under the guardianship of the regent, Chief Jongintaba Dalinjebo. It was there, listening to the elders debate long into the night in the regent's court, that I first understood something about democracy that no Englishman ever taught me. Everyone spoke, the Induna, the commoner, the visitor from a neighboring village, and no one was silenced, however foolish or repetitive his argument, until the chief had heard the whole of it. The chief was not above criticism. He was simply asked to render at the end a judgment that the whole assembly could accept. Democracy, I learned before I learned to write, means that every voice matters, even when it is inconvenient.
That seems a long way from the South Africa you'd grow into.
It was the furthest possible distance. I did not yet know the word apartheid. I did not yet know I was, in the eyes of the law that governed the very ground I stood on, less than a man.
You've written that the Regent's Court taught you your first real lesson in leadership, not just in democracy, but in how a leader should behave.
Yes, I watched Chief Jongintaba many times, and I noticed something I did not fully appreciate until I was a much older man myself. He would sit at these gatherings and say almost nothing until the very end. He simply listened to the herdsmen as attentively as to the wealthiest man in the district, and only when every voice had exhausted itself did he speak. And even then, he spoke not to declare his own opinion as law, but to summarize what he had heard and to guide the assembly toward whatever agreement was possible. I have described this before as a shepherd leading from behind. He allows the more nimble members of the flock to go out ahead and only realizes, once they have found their own way, that he has been directing them the entire time. I tried to lead that way for the whole of my life, with mixed success, I will admit. It is a far harder discipline than it sounds. A young man is always tempted to prove his cleverness by speaking first and loudest. It took me decades to unlearn that temptation.
You went through initiation, circumcision school, as a teenager. You've written about it in some detail. Why does that moment matter so much to you, looking back?
Because it was there, at the Halara, that I was first lied to, in a way I could not forgive quickly. Circumcision for the Xhosa is not merely a surgical fact. It marks the passage from boyhood to manhood. A boy who is uncircumcised cannot inherit, cannot marry, is not, in the fullest sense, a man among his people. At the ceremony, one of our leaders, Chief Melichili, rose to speak, and instead of the customary words of celebration, he told us the truth. He said that we, the flower of Xhosa youth, were a conquered people, that our chiefs existed only to serve a greater authority, that we had no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our own birth. There was silence. It was not the speech anyone wanted at a celebration. I was angry with him, if I am honest. I thought he had spoiled a sacred day with bitterness. It took me years, many years, to understand that he alone, that day, had told us the truth, and every other voice in that valley had been telling us a comfortable lie.
When did the lie stop working on you?
Gradually, and then all at once, as these things do. I went to Fort Hare, the only university for Africans in the country, believing I would become an interpreter or a clerk in the Native Affairs Department, a great ambition for a boy of the Transkei. I was expelled in my second year for joining a boycott over the powers of the Student Representative Council. A small matter, a matter of student democracy, but I would not back down, and neither would the university. Chief Jongintaba was furious with me. He gave me an ultimatum: return to Fort Hare and apologize, or he would arrange my marriage immediately to a bride he had already chosen. I fled to Johannesburg in the night, together with his own son, Justice, rather than submit to either. I arrived with nothing: a pair of trousers too short for me, borrowed money, no papers permitting me to be in the city at all, which was itself a crime under the law.
What was that first arrival like?
Frightening and then exhilarating in that order. I found work briefly as a night watchman at a mine compound, and there I saw for the first time, in the barracks of thousands of migrant laborers living 12 to a room, the sheer scale of what this system extracted from African bodies to build white wealth. It was in Johannesburg that I met Walter Sisulu, then a young estate agent, who would become the truest friend of my life, closer to me than any blood relation. And it was Walter who took me to a Jewish attorney named Lazar Sidelsky and asked him, as a favor, to take me on as an articled clerk. Sidelsky did more than give me a desk. He gave me his old suits when mine wore through, and he gave me, without ever lecturing me on the subject, an example of a white man who simply treated me as he would treat any other young man trying to make his way, which, in that country, in that decade, was itself a small act of quiet defiance. It was in Johannesburg, in the gold mines, in the slums, in that small office, that I began slowly to see the machine whole.
The machine being the legal architecture of segregation.
Yes, I trained as a lawyer because I believed in those years that the law, however unjust in its particulars, still contained the promise of its own correction. I believed a court was a place where truth, argued well enough, might still prevail. I was young. I did not yet understand that a courtroom built entirely by one race to judge another is not a flawed instrument of justice. It is a flawless instrument of something else entirely.
You joined the ANC in 1944 and helped found the Youth League. What did you and men like Sisulu and Tambo think was wrong with the ANC as it existed?
It was too polite. Forgive me, that is not quite fair to men I loved and respected, men like Dr. Kuma. But the old ANC believed in deputations, in petitions to the Crown, in the hope that reasoned argument would eventually move the conscience of white South Africa. We, Sisulu, Tambo, Anton Lembede, and we had watched that strategy fail for 30 years while the laws grew crueler, not kinder. We wanted mass action, strikes, boycotts, defiance, not because we relished conflict, but because petitions had been tried, and petitions had achieved nothing but the National Party's election in 1948 and the codification of apartheid as formal law.
1948 is the year everything hardens.
It is the year the informal cruelty of segregation became a totalizing philosophy of the state with a name and a bureaucracy. Every one of us, African, colored, Indian, was to be classified, controlled, confined to an area, permitted to work only at the pleasure of a white employer, forbidden to move without a pass. I want to be exact about this because the people romanticize the past and forget its texture. Apartheid did not simply deny us votes. It told a man where he could sleep, whom he could marry, what floor of a building he could stand on. It was total.
Before we go further into the politics, you married twice during this period. Your first wife, Evelyn, and then Winnie. I'd like to understand what the struggle cost you at home, even in these early years.
I married Evelyn Mesa in 1944. She was a cousin of Walter's, training as a nurse, a gentle and devout woman. We had 4 children together, though we lost our first daughter, Makaziwe, as an infant, a grief I have never fully set down in words, even now. Evelyn was a Jehovah's Witness by conviction, and she believed, quite sincerely, that politics was a vain pursuit next to the coming kingdom, while I was becoming consumed more each year by the ANC. We grew apart along that fault line, not through betrayal in the way newspapers later liked to suggest, but through 2 people pulling in earnest toward 2 different definitions of what a life should be devoted to. It ended in divorce, and I do not think I was blameless in how that ending was managed. I was frequently absent, frequently arrested, frequently a poor father to Tembi, Makato, and Makaziwe in those years, and I have made my peace with that failing, without pretending it was not a failing.
And Winnie?
I met Winnie Madikizela in 1957 at a bus stop of all places. She was the first black medical social worker at Baragwanath Hospital, extraordinarily striking and extraordinarily serious about her own convictions, which is what truly drew me to her more than anything else. I was by then a defendant in the treason trial. My first marriage was ending, and I courted her in the strange, hurried manner of a man who did not know how many free years remained to him. I proposed to her, I confess, in a rather unromantic fashion. I told her what she would be marrying into, a man already given substantially to the ANC, and asked whether she was prepared for that life. She said she was. I do not think either of us in 1958 fully understood what that life would demand of her. The raids, the detentions, the solitary confinement she herself endured, the raising of our 2 daughters, Zenani and Zinzi, largely alone, while I was in hiding and then in prison. I've always believed that Winnie paid a higher price for my convictions than I ever paid myself, because I, at least, had chosen the life I was living. She inherited hers.
You led the Defiance campaign in 1952, deliberately breaking unjust laws in the open and accepting arrest. That's the Gandhian model, isn't it? Nonviolent civil disobedience?
It was, and I organized it faithfully, and I was arrested for it, and I do not regret a single day of it. But I will tell you something I've told very few interviewers so plainly. Even then, I harbored private doubts about nonviolence as a permanent creed. I said as much once at a meeting and was severely reprimanded by the ANC executive for it. Chief Lutuli and others thought me impulsive, and perhaps I was. But here was my honest thought, forming slowly in me through the 1950s. Nonviolence for me was never a moral principle. It was a strategy. There is no moral virtue in clinging to a weapon that has stopped working. Gandhi faced a colonial power in India that ultimately proved realistic enough to negotiate its own departure. I did not believe the Afrikaner National Party was that kind of opponent. I believed, and I said so, that if peaceful protest is met only with bullets, its efficacy is finished.
That is a striking thing to hear from the man most associated in the world's memory with reconciliation.
I know it does not fit the icon, but I did not live my life to fit an icon. I lived it to free my people. And if you sand down every rough or difficult truth In the pursuit of a comfortable legend, you have not honored me. You have replaced me with someone easier to admire and harder to learn from. So let me say it without apology. By 1960, after the police massacre at Sharpeville, 69 people shot, many in the back, as they fled a peaceful protest against the past laws. I concluded that the ANC's 60-year commitment to strictly non-violent methods was no longer a policy. It was a slogan the government could shoot through with impunity, and did.
Between the Defiance Campaign and Umkhonto, there's the Treason Trial, 1956 to 1961. Nearly 5 years. That's a long time to live under threat of the gallows.
156 of us were arrested in the early hours of a December morning in 1956 and charged with high treason, for which the penalty at that time was death. It is difficult to convey what it does to a man's daily life to spend nearly 5 years commuting, in effect, to his own potential execution. We would sit in the dock through the day, evidence dragging on for months over an alliance the state claimed was a communist conspiracy to overthrow the government by violence, and then return home in the evening to raise children, argue with wives, pay rent, as though it were an ordinary life. It was not an ordinary life. It was a rehearsal for death that simply kept being postponed. And yet, I look back on that trial now and find, oddly, some of the closest camaraderie of my life within it. 156 accused of every race, sharing meals, sharing jokes in the corridors of the court, debating strategy long into the night. The charges against all of us were eventually withdrawn in 1961 for lack of evidence the state itself must have known was insufficient from the outset. We had won, but 5 years of a man's life and the lives of his family is not restored merely because a verdict finally goes in his favor.
And so, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation.
I had found it in 1961, and I make no apology for that either. I went to Chief Luthuli, our president, who remained committed to non-violence to the end of his life, and I told him plainly that I intended to press for a military wing, whether the ANC as a body endorsed it or not, that I would form it myself outside the ANC if necessary, and invite the ANC to associate itself with it after the fact, if it wished. That was, I recognize now, close to insubordination toward a man I revered. He resisted at first, but he came to see, as most of the leadership eventually did, that we had exhausted the legal and the peaceful in that order, and what remained was sabotage, attacks on infrastructure, on power stations, on installations of the state, deliberately organized to avoid loss of life, because even in turning to violence, I insisted on limits.
Why sabotage specifically, rather than open war?
Because I calculated, and this was a cold calculation, I will not dress it as anything gentler, that sabotage offered the best hope of forcing the government to the table without provoking the kind of bitterness between black and white that would poison whatever country came after. I studied guerrilla warfare. I read Clausewitz and Mao and the history of the Cuban and Algerian and Israeli struggles. I traveled through Africa under a false name to seek training and funds for our recruits. I was, by then, the most wanted man in South Africa, moving in disguise, sometimes as a chauffeur in overalls and a cap, sometimes as a farm laborer, once for months as the gardener and driver of a white sympathizer's house in the northern suburbs, a house where I would emerge each morning in a servant's coat and drive to secret meetings of the underground high command. The newspapers called me the Black Pimpernel. I rather enjoyed the name, I confess, though it was a dangerous game, and I knew it would end in either my death or my capture. I left the country secretly in January 1962, traveling under a false name and a forged passport. And for the better part of a year, I was, for the first time in my life, a free man in the fullest sense. I addressed the Pan-African Freedom Movement in Addis Ababa. I met Emperor Haile Selassie. I received basic military training in Ethiopia and Morocco, learning to handle firearms and explosives at an age when most men have long finished with such lessons. I traveled to London as well and stood quietly, almost like any tourist, before the Houses of Parliament, the very model of the democratic institution I had praised, even while condemning the empire that built it. It remains one of the strange ironies of my life that I felt more at liberty as a fugitive with a price on his head than I had ever felt as a lawyer in my own country. It ended in my capture in August 1962, driving back from Durban, disguised as a chauffeur for my friend Cecil Williams. Betrayed, I have always believed, by information passed to the police about my movements, though the precise channel was never proven to my satisfaction. And I confess I have my suspicions, even now, that I have chosen not to air publicly.
And then Rivonia, the trial that could have ended in your execution.
Rivonia, yes. I want you to understand what that trial was, because it has been flattened by history into a single famous speech, and the speech deserves its fame. But it was not a performance, it was a calculation made with my co-accused that we would use the dock not to plead for our lives, but to place the ANC's case before the world and before history. My attorneys advised a traditional plea in mitigation. I told them I intended instead to make a statement from the dock, not subject to cross-examination, and that I would use it to explain and justify everything Umkhonto had done without groveling for mercy.
You knew that might mean a death sentence.
I assumed it probably would. I told my advocate, Bram Fisher, a brave Afrikaner, who later gave his own freedom for our cause, that if I must die, I preferred to die on my feet rather than live on my knees. I wrote out the closing words of that speech myself and memorized them, so that when the moment came, I could lift my eyes from the page and look Justice de Wet directly in the face. I said that I'd fought against white domination and I'd fought against black domination. I want that second half remembered as much as the first, because I never once believed the objective was to replace one tyranny of race with another. I said I cherished the ideal of a free and democratic society in which all persons lived together in harmony with equal opportunity. That it was an ideal I hoped to live for, but if needs be, an ideal I was prepared to die for. There was a silence in that courtroom afterward that I've never experienced before or since. perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt far longer, and then a kind of collective groan from the gallery and the sound of women weeping.
You were sentenced to life, not death. Do you know why?
International pressure, certainly. There were protests outside South African embassies, from London to New York. Some have said Justice de Wet himself was reluctant to make martyrs of us. I do not know the whole truth of it, and I've stopped pretending to. What I know is that I walked out of that courtroom expecting never to walk freely again, and I made my peace with that before the verdict was even read. That peace, arriving at it honestly, not performing it, was, I think, one of the most important achievements of my inner life. Fear does not vanish. You simply decide it will not be the one who decides your actions.
27 years. 18 of them on Robben Island. In a cell, I understand, not much larger than a bathroom.
7 feet by 8 feet, roughly, with a straw mat on a concrete floor and a bucket for a toilet. I want to correct a sentimental impression people sometimes carry. That prison was simply grim, and one endured it, and that was that. Prison was an assault, deliberate and calculated, on the interior architecture of a man's mind. We were given the lowest category diet allowed to prisoners because we were classified African. Colored and Indian prisoners received slightly more, which was its own particular cruelty, a way of fracturing solidarity even inside a cell block. We broke stones into gravel, then were made to dig lime in a quarry that blinded some of us, permanently damaged my own eyes from the glare of the white rock under an unshaded sun. Letters from home were delayed for months, censored, sometimes cut to ribbons with scissors before we received them. Entire paragraphs missing, so that a letter from your wife might arrive as fragments that told you your child had been in an accident, but not whether the child had lived.
How did you survive that, psychologically? Not just physically, the mind.
Discipline. I do not say that lightly or as a platitude for a poster. I mean it literally. I built a structure for each day, exercise in the mornings, study in whatever hours I was permitted, a garden I fought for the right to cultivate, and I held to that structure with a rigidity that some of my comrades found almost comic, but it was not comic to me. A man in a cell with nothing to organize his hours will be organized instead by his despair, and I had watched that happen to other men. I decided early that I would leave that island whenever I left it as the same man who entered it, or better, not broken, not embittered beyond use to my people. Some nights I did not manage that. I will tell you honestly, there were nights of real despair, particularly in the earliest years, when I did not know whether the outside world had already forgotten us.
Your letters from that period, the ones collected later, are far more raw than the public image of you. There's a moment where you write of feeling lonely and empty.
Yes, I will not pretend otherwise for the sake of legend. There is a passage where I describe an evening when I felt utterly hollow, and it was the kindness of the men around me, comrades who had their own grief and somehow still had generosity left over for mine, that pulled me back from it. Robben Island functioned in its strange way as a university and a fellowship as much as a prison, because we were together, argument by argument, decade by decade. Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, so many others. We debated everything: Marxism, the future constitution, whether armed struggle should continue, whether to negotiate at all. That community of serious men, thinking seriously together under the worst conditions imaginable, may have saved my mind as much as any discipline I imposed on myself.
Did the prisoners ever fight back in an organized way against those conditions?
Constantly. We fought over everything because everything was a battlefield in miniature. The length of our trousers, whether we would be given long trousers at all instead of the short ones given only to Africans as a mark of boyhood. The right to study by correspondence, the right to newspapers, the quality of the food. We staged hunger strikes more than once. I remember one clearly in the early 1970s, when conditions had become particularly punitive. We refused food for several days, and I recall the strange lightheadedness of it, the way hunger sharpens the mind, even as it weakens the body, and the argument among us afterward about whether the strike had achieved anything at all, or whether we had simply punished ourselves for the private satisfaction of having resisted. I was never entirely certain the hunger strikes changed policy. I was certain they changed us. They reminded us and reminded our jailers that our bodies remained, in the smallest way, our own to risk.
Not every warder was your enemy, though. I understand there were exceptions.
There were, and I think it important to say so, because it would be a lie of convenience to claim every white man on that island was a monster. There was a young warder, Christo Brand, who arrived as barely more than a boy, raised on all the propaganda of his upbringing to believe I was a terrorist, and who came slowly over years to treat me with a decency that grew into something like friendship, smuggling in bread, allowing me extra minutes with my grandchild on a rare visit. Small kindnesses that could have cost him his own position had they been discovered. I do not offer this to excuse the system he served. I offer it because I have always believed that even inside the machinery of the worst human cruelty, individual men retain the capacity to choose decency. And I wanted my whole life to give men that chance to choose it, rather than assume in advance that they could not.
You also faced serious health scares in prison.
In the 1980s, after I had been transferred to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland, I contracted tuberculosis, in part from the damp of my cell there, and it left my lungs permanently weakened. I still, even now, must be careful of chest infections that would trouble another man far less. There was a period when the government, I believe, feared rather seriously that I might die in their custody, which would have been a catastrophe for them politically, whatever their private feelings toward me. It was around that same period, in 1985, that President Botha offered me a conditional release, freedom, if I would simply renounce violence unconditionally, without any corresponding change in the system that had made violence necessary in the first place. I refused, and I asked my daughter Zinzi to read my response aloud at a rally in Soweto, since I could not attend it myself. I told the people, through her voice, that prisoners cannot enter into contracts, that only free men can negotiate, and that I would not sell my birthright, nor sell the birthright of the people, for my own conditional and personal freedom. It was, I believe, one of the most important refusals of my life. Freedom offered on the oppressor's terms is not freedom. It is merely a different cell with better furniture.
What was the hardest single thing, if you can name one?
Not being able to protect my family. I have been asked this many times, and I give the same honest answer every time. My wife, Winnie, was harassed, detained, assaulted by the security police in those years, hounded from job after job. The police would go to her employer and say plainly that keeping her on staff would bring them trouble, and I could do nothing. Nothing. I could write a letter that would arrive 4 months late with half its sentences cut away by a censor's scissors. That powerlessness, the specific powerlessness of a husband and father who cannot stand between his family and the state that is punishing them for his own convictions, that was worse than the quarry, worse than the cell, worse than any of it. I told myself, to survive it, that this was the price we had agreed to pay for the struggle. That was true. It did not make the price smaller.
Did you ever, in any private moment, doubt that the price was worth it?
I will answer you honestly rather than nobly. I doubted particular decisions, whether a specific operation had been wise, whether I had judged a comrade correctly, whether I had been too harsh with my own family in the choices I made before my arrest. I do not recall ever doubting the cause itself, not for one full day. But do not mistake certainty about the cause for comfort about its cost. Robben Island taught me that a man can be entirely convinced he is right and entirely devastated by what being right has required of the people he loves. Both things were true of me at once for 27 years.
I don't want to make the whole of Robben Island sound like unrelenting grimness. Was there room for humor, for ordinary human pettiness, even joy?
Enormous room. And I insist on that being remembered, because a man who is only ever solemn becomes eventually unbearable even to himself. We argued constantly over absurd things, whether a particular comrade had taken too large a share of the porridge, whose turn it was to tend the garden, the correct pronunciation of an English word one of us had encountered in a smuggled book. I was known among the men, I am told, for a certain fussiness about my appearance and my exercise regime, even in a prison uniform. I would do my exercises each morning at precisely the same hour, and I received a fair amount of teasing for the discipline of it. There was real laughter on that island, real friendship, real warmth between men who had every reason to have none of it left in them. I think that surprises people more than the suffering does. Suffering they expect. Laughter inside a place built to destroy the capacity for laughter. That is the detail I most want remembered, because it is the detail that proves the system failed, even when it succeeded in nearly everything else.
You've spoken about reading widely in prison. Tolstoy, Marx, Shakespeare, among the prisoner's own smuggled copy. Did your political thinking change inside?
Considerably, though slower than people assume. Freedom is not a lightning bolt. It is a long correspondence with oneself. I went in believing still in a fairly orthodox nationalist framework. I came out having read deeply in Africana history as well. I made a study, almost an obsession, of the language and the historical grievances of the very men who guarded me, because I understood, even then, that we would eventually have to share a country with them, and a man cannot negotiate honestly with a people whose fears he has never bothered to learn. I began to see gradually that the Afrikaner was not simply my enemy, but a man who had constructed his own fortress out of his own historical fear of annihilation by the British, by the size of the black majority around him. Understanding that did not make his system any less monstrous, but it made me capable eventually of sitting across a table from him without wanting only his destruction.
That seems to be the seed of everything that came after, the negotiations, the presidency.
It was in the mid-1980s, without consulting my own organization in exile, a decision some of my comrades were furious with me for, and I understood their fury. I opened a private, secret channel of talks with the government, first through intermediaries, eventually meeting government ministers myself, and finally the state president, P.W. Botha, and then his successor, F.W. de Klerk. I want to be clear about why I did this without authorization. I judged as an old man now, closer to the end of my life than the beginning of it, that if I waited for a full consensus among exiled leaders scattered across the world, we would negotiate nothing before I died in that cell, and the country would bleed further in the meantime. I took the risk on my own authority. It could have destroyed my credibility with my own people. I judged it worth the risk.
Did faith play any part in sustaining you through those years? You were raised a Methodist, I understand.
I was, and I attended church services on the island when they were permitted, and I found something steadying in the ritual of it, though I have never been a man given to elaborate theology. I do not think I survived 27 years because I believed God had a particular plan for me. I have always been suspicious of leaders who claim that sort of certainty, because it is a short distance from believing God has chosen you to believing you may therefore do as you please. What I did believe, and still believe, is closer to something my grandmother might have called faith, and a philosopher might call a moral conviction, that the arc of human affairs benches, however slowly and however violently interrupted, toward a wider circle of dignity, and that a man's task is simply to place his own shoulder against that arc for whatever portion of his life he is given, without demanding to see the whole distance covered before he dies. I did not expect, frankly, to live to see the changes I saw. I made my peace with dying in that cell, having only pushed the boulder a few more inches up the hill. That the hill crested in my own lifetime was not something I had faith would happen. It was to me simply an enormous piece of good fortune, arriving very late, that I have never stopped being by.
February the 11th, 1990. Walking out of the gate. What was actually in your mind, as opposed to what the cameras showed?
Fear, if I am honest with you. Not for myself, but that I would fail. I've been in prison so long that I worried quite seriously whether I still had the judgment to lead men and women who had spent those same 27 years fighting in exile, in townships, in a country that had transformed itself in my absence in ways I had only read about, months late, in censored fragments. I also remember, quite absurdly, that as I raised my fist for the cameras, I was already calculating the route to the first rally and worrying whether we had adequate security, because I understood immediately, within the very first hour of my freedom, that my life belonged to the negotiation now, not to myself. There was very little private joy in that moment. There was mostly duty, arriving all at once.
The negotiations nearly collapsed entirely at one point, in April 1993, when Chris Hani was assassinated.
Chris Hani was one of the most beloved men in our movement, particularly among the young, a leader of Umkhonto Wesizwe and of the Communist Party, gunned down in his own driveway by a white right-wing extremist in front of his neighbors, in an act calculated, I have no doubt, to provoke exactly the race war that extremist wanted. The country stood at the edge of a precipice that week, in a way it had not, I believe, at any other single moment in the entire negotiation process. Townships erupted. I understood within hours that if I did not speak directly to the nation, not as a negotiating partner of the government, but as the one voice that black and white South Africans might both, however reluctantly, still hear, the country could tip into the civil war I had spent a decade trying to prevent. I went on national television, still at that time only a leader of a liberation movement, not yet a head of state, and I appealed for calm, and I said deliberately that a white man full of prejudice and hate had come to our country and committed a deed so foul that our whole nation now teetered on the brink of disaster, but that a white woman of Afrikaner origin had risked her own life so that we might know and bring to justice the assassin. I said this precisely because I wanted every South African, black and white, to hear that the line between good and evil in that moment did not run cleanly along the color line, and that the peace still had defenders on both sides of it. The funeral was enormous and volatile and could easily have become a massacre. It did not. I count that week among the most important interventions of my life, and very few history books give it the weight it deserves.
The formal negotiations that followed, Codessa, and then the drafting of the interim constitution, were nearly derailed more than once, weren't they? Not only by Hani's assassination, but by violence between the ANC and Inkatha, and by the government's own security forces, which many believed were secretly fueling that violence.
That is not merely a belief. I stated it publicly at the time, and I have seen no reason since to soften the accusation. There was what we came to call a third force, elements within the security establishment who had every incentive to see the negotiations fail, who fueled violence between ourselves and Chief Buthelez's Inkatha movement in the hope that black South Africans would appear to a watching world and to a nervous white electorate incapable of governing themselves without descending into factional slaughter. I confronted de Klerk directly about this more than once, in terms considerably less polite than history usually records, because I believed then and believe now that his government either knew of this violence and tolerated it, or had lost control of its own security apparatus, and I am not certain which of those two possibilities was worse. Despite that, we continued negotiating because the alternative to negotiating through anger was not negotiating through calm. It was not negotiating at all, and that price was one neither side, in the end, was prepared to pay.
And then you became president in 1994, in the first fully democratic election in South Africa's history. And you did something that surprised, even angered, many of your own supporters. You pursued reconciliation with the very people who had imprisoned you, rather than retribution.
I understand the anger. I want to say something plainly, because it is often softened into sentiment. Reconciliation was not for me a gesture of saintly forgiveness performed for the comfort of white South Africans or the admiration of the world's press. It was strategy, exactly as nonviolence had once been strategy, and exactly as armed struggle had once been strategy. I looked at the map of the country I now had to govern. Whites controlled the economy, the civil service, the army, the police, the farms, nearly the entirety of the machinery a modern state requires to function. A campaign of vengeance, however emotionally justified, after 3 centuries of dispossession, would have collapsed that machinery, and it was the poorest black South Africans, not the wealthy whites, who could flee to London or Perth with their capital, who would have starved in the wreckage. Reconciliation was the price of a functioning country. I have never claimed it was the price of a fully just one, and I want that distinction remembered, because I think we left too much land, too much wealth, too much economic power untouched in the settlement we reached. And I do not know, even now, whether that was wisdom or a failure of nerve. That history will eventually judge harshly.
That's a remarkable admission, that the reconciliation you're most celebrated for may have come at too high an economic cost.
I did not say I regret it entirely. I say I hold it honestly, with its full weight, rather than as a triumph without shadow. We ended a system of legal race supremacy without civil war, without the bloodbath that many, myself included, in my darker calculations of the 1980s, believed inevitable. That is not nothing, but a black child in Soweto in 1996 still went to a West school on West land with worse prospects than a white child in Sandton. And a change of flag and anthem does not repair 300 years of that in a single generation, or several. I said at the time, and I believe it still, that political freedom without economic transformation is an unfinished revolution. We finished the first half. The second half remains the work of those who come after me, and I have never pretended otherwise, to spare anyone's comfort, including my own.
Some on the more radical left of your own movement accused you, in those years, of having sold out, of trading real economic liberation for a symbolic handover of political power, while the old economic order stayed largely intact. How do you answer that charge, honestly, not diplomatically?
I take the charge seriously, because it is not a foolish one, and I will not dismiss the men and women who made it as merely bitter or naive. Some of them had fought as hard as I had. Some had lost more than I had. And they watched the settlement we negotiated and saw the mines still in the same hands, the land still in the same hands, the banks still in the same hands, and they asked, reasonably, what exactly had been won beyond the right to vote for a government that would inherit an economy built entirely to exclude a very majority now permitted to elect it? My honest answer is this: I judged at the time that we could not win the political transition and the economic transformation in the same negotiation, in the same decade, without the entire settlement collapsing into precisely the civil war I had spent 30 years trying to prevent. I chose to secure the political foundation first and trust the generations after me to build the economic house upon it. I do not know, even now, whether that was statesmanship or a failure of nerve. I have lived long enough to hear both arguments made persuasively, sometimes by the same person in the same conversation. What I will not accept is the suggestion that I did not understand the trade I was making. I understood it entirely. I made it with open eyes, and I have carried the weight of that choice, not merely the credit for it.
One term as president, and then you step down, voluntarily, almost unheard of on a continent where so many liberation leaders became lifelong rulers.
I watched that pattern across Africa for decades from my cell. Men who had fought bravely for freedom and then could not bring themselves to relinquish the power that freedom handed them, until liberation curdled into a new tyranny wearing the old slogans. I decided, long before I ever held office, that I would not be one of those men. 5 years was what I judged the country needed from me to stabilize, to see one peaceful transfer of power performed as proof that it could be done, and not 1 day more. I do not think a leader who clings past his usefulness is serving his people any longer. I think by then he is only serving his own fear of no longer mattering, and I resolved never to let that fear govern me the way it governed men I had watched and pitied and sometimes admired for their courage, while despising the corruption their long rule bred.
After you left office in 1999, you didn't retire quietly. You became in some ways more outspoken on one particular issue: HIV and AIDS.
I have been asked more than once why I did not speak forcefully enough about AIDS while I was president. And it is a fair criticism, one I have accepted rather than deflected. I was consumed in those 5 years with the survival of the political settlement itself, and I underestimated, as many leaders of my generation did across this continent, the scale of what was coming. I resolved, once I left office, to spend whatever years remained to me correcting that failure as loudly as I could. And then, in 2005, I did something that I knew would cause discomfort in my own family and among my own people, where illness of that particular kind was still spoken of only in, if at all. I announced publicly that my son, Makato, had died of AIDS-related illness, rather than allow the family to issue the customary vague statement about a long illness. which in our country had become a kind of coded shame. I said plainly that the only way to make people understand this disease was ordinary and survivable in its stigma, if not always in its cause, was to stop the silence at the very top in my own household, publicly, without euphemism. I do not know how many lives that announcement changed. I know it was one of the harder things I did as an old man, and I do not regret it.
You are remembered, almost everywhere in the world, as a symbol of forgiveness. Do you think that word, forgiveness, is even the right one for what you actually did?
I have wondered about that word myself many times. Forgiveness, as it is usually meant, suggests a kind of forgetting, or at least a setting aside of the ledger out of some purity of heart. I want to be honest with you. I did not forget. I remember every year of those 27, every insult, every letter arriving with half its sentences cut away, every report of my wife being hounded from her work. I have not forgotten a single one of those things, and I do not think a man should be asked to forget them, because a country built on convenient forgetting will only repeat the crime it has agreed not to name. What I chose instead of forgetting was to refuse to let my resentment become the architect of the next 50 years, the way apartheid had been the architect of the last 300. That is a colder, more deliberate thing than the word forgiveness usually suggests. And I suspect it is also a more useful thing because it does not depend on a saintliness that very few men actually possess. It depends only on arithmetic, on understanding clearly which of your feelings will build a future for your grandchildren and which will only build another prison for someone else's grandchildren somewhere down the road.
We have a tradition on this show. Before we close, we ask for two things: something personal and a piece of advice for the next guest. Can you tell us something personal about you? An anecdote, maybe something funny that you remember.
Very well. Let me tell you about a breakfast that nearly killed me, or so a Nevers prison major seemed to believe. This was in the late 1980s, after I had been hospitalized with tuberculosis and moved under heavy guard to a private clinic near Paulsmoor that had never in its history admitted a black patient. My very first morning there, an orderly brought in my tray, and I discovered scrambled eggs, 3 rashers of bacon, and buttered toast, a breakfast I had not tasted in longer than I could remember, since prison food offers a man very little to look forward to. I had by then also developed high blood pressure, and my doctors had ordered a strict low cholesterol diet, though evidently no one had informed the clinic's kitchen of this fact. Just as I lifted a forkful of egg to my mouth, the major overseeing my security reached across the table and said quite sternly, "No, Mandela, that is against the orders of your physician." I held on to that tray, I promise you, with both hands, and I said to him, "Major, I am sorry. If this breakfast will kill me, then today I am prepared to die." He let me keep it. I have always found it rather funny that a man who had spent a quarter of a century negotiating with a government prepared to hang him found his most stubborn hour of resistance was over 3 rashers of bacon.
That may be the best use of that particular sentence I've ever heard. Previous guest gave you this advice: do not deceive yourself. Most men will praise virtue in others while practicing the opposite when it serves them. Do not be one of those who are destroyed by their own illusions. See the world as it is, hardest, competitive, and indifferent to morality, and act with your eyes open. Any thoughts on that?
Tell your previous guest I have read him closely, more closely than he might expect from a man he would likely have filed under idealist, a category I suspect he did not intend as a compliment. He is not wrong about everything, and I will not insult him by pretending otherwise. I made cold calculations myself. I told you so plainly earlier in this very conversation. When I helped form Umkhonto weSizwe, I did not consult my feelings about violence. I consulted the arithmetic of what nonviolence could still achieve against a government that had answered petitions with Sharpeville. When I pursued reconciliation as president, I told you honestly it was strategy before it was virtue. I looked at who controlled the mines, the army, the banks, and I built my policy around that map of power, not around a wish for how power ought to be distributed. So do not let anyone tell you I walked through this world with my eyes closed, trusting to the goodness of men. I did not. I read the same history your previous guest read, the same broken promises, the same convenient cruelties dressed up as necessity. But here is where I part from him, and I want to be precise about the parting because it is not sentimentality. He says the world is indifferent to morality and act accordingly. I say the world is indifferent, yes, but men are not required to be. That is the entire distinction my life was spent trying to prove at considerable cost. I sat in a cell for 27 years, surrounded by men who had every rational incentive, by his logic, to become as brutal as their jailers. And some warders did try to make us so, deliberately, because a broken man is easier to rule than a decent one. I watched comrades resist that logic day after day, not because they were naive about the world's cruelty, but because they had decided, with eyes fully open, that cruelty would not be permitted to author the rest of their character. That is not illusion. That is the one act of authorship a prisoner has left when every other freedom has been stripped from him, and I would not trade it for all the clear-eyed cynicism in Florence. I will grant him this much, and it is not nothing. The man who mistakes wishful thinking for strategy will be destroyed by his own illusions, precisely as he warns. I saw naive men destroyed that way too. But I would say to him, and I suspect this is where we would have argued for hours, had history seated us across the same table, that seeing the world as harsh is only half the education. The other half is deciding deliberately which harshness you will still refuse to practice yourself, even when it would serve you. He built a philosophy on the first half. I tried imperfectly to build a life on both.
Now, a piece of advice for whoever sits in this chair after you.
I will give the same counsel I would give any young person in any century, sitting where you are, asking me to imagine them sitting. It is this: courage is not the absence of fear. I have heard that phrase repeated back to me so often now that it risks becoming a decoration, a thing embroidered on a cushion. And I want to rescue it from that fate, because I mean it exactly as plainly as it sounds. I have been afraid more times in my life than I could ever count. walking into that courtroom at Rivonia, crossing borders under a false name with a price on my head, waiting in a cell at night, not knowing whether the world outside had forgotten I existed. I did not defeat that fear by pretending it was not there. I defeated it by refusing to let it be the one who decided what I did next. So tell whoever comes after me, be afraid if you must. You likely will not have a choice in the matter, but do not mistake your fear for your instructions. It is only ever a feeling. It is never an order.
Nelson Mandela, thank you, truly, for this conversation.
Thank you for asking the difficult questions as often as the easy ones. That too is a form of respect. Go well.
And that's our episode. Next time on Voices of the Past, someone else entirely. Thank you for watching and subscribe for more.